Welcome to my narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting Blossoms in the Valley. The painting on the left is my interpretation of the photo on the right, which was my reference and inspiration for this painting. I've done a fairly detailed sketch with a B pencil. It has much more detail than what I often start my paintings with. Unlike many of my paintings where I take a stylized approach, I want this to be a more direct representation of my reference material. Therefore, I've started with a bit more detail in my sketch. A lot of times when I start my paintings, I start with a large loose wash, working with bigger shapes, and then I start working with smaller shapes and darker values. I'm going to take a little bit different approach with this painting, and I'm painting more direct with this piece and using the reference photo throughout the process a lot more than what I normally do. So as I build my layers, I'm going to build them differently than what I often do in many of my paintings. So to start out, I'm taking a light wash of Naples yellow, and I'm putting it throughout the composition in areas that I want to have highlighted with sunlight and give the suggestion that it's being hit with sunlight when I'm done with my painting. So I'm putting this on as my initial layer in some of the areas. Here I've put the Naples yellow in a variety of areas throughout my composition, and now I'm taking a little cad yellow light, and I'm painting the areas that are the stamen part of the flower with this cad yellow light. Next, I'm going to start to work in some of the cooler shades here in the shadowed areas of the flower. And to do that, I'm using a mixture of cobalt blue and rose madder quinacridone. This gives me a light purplish tone that I can use in the shadowed areas, and I'll vary this mixture a little bit. It's sometimes adding a little bit more of the rose madder quinacridone, and other times shifting a little bit more towards the cobalt blue side, and gives a little bit of variation even within these shadowed areas. Here I've continued to progress with this cool tone, and to this point these have been somewhat flat, hard-edged washes that I'm doing that represent some very definitive shadowed areas. Next, I'm going to take and put down a little bit of water in these areas where I'm going to put some more of the same tone, but I'm going to do it wet into wet, and I'm going to let that paint flow around a little bit, and that's going to give me a softer edge. I'm doing the same thing here, and I'm putting down clear water, and then I'm just going to bring a little bit of my mixture of the quinacridone rose and cobalt blue, and just touch it into that area that I've put the water. So it gives a nice soft edge and kind of a diffused shadow area. I'm continuing with this cobalt blue and rose madder mixture, painting these shadowed areas. Many of these shapes I've described earlier when I did my initial sketch. As I had mentioned, I put a little bit more detail in the sketch than I sometimes do. And the mixture I'm using right now is leaning a little bit more towards cobalt blue, whereas the shapes right above that area have a greater influence of rose madder. And I vary this mixture as I work through these shadowed areas. At this point, I've worked across the entire composition, putting in some of these cool tones to represent the shadowed areas. And I've inserted the reference photo in the top right corner, and you can see the areas that I've been working on are primarily just on these white flower shapes. I've yet to get into the background or the leafy areas that surround the flowers. So I've been focused right now on working on the flowered areas. And from here, what I'll do is there's just a little bit of a pink tone, which is hard to pick up in the small shape of the reference photo, but I'll pick up a little bit of the pink tone that's in some of the areas of this flower, and then I'm going to start working in some of the negative space areas that surround the leafy shapes and the flowers themselves. Here I'm putting in this soft highlight of a pink tone. I'm using a color called Opera, which is a very pink tone, and it's kind of an accent color that's used sometimes to get attention. It can get pretty strong if you use it with full pigmentation, and this is just a light wash of this pink tone to give the indication of these pink highlights that are on these flower blossoms. I've been doing all my brush work with an Escoda Reserva number 4, which is a nice sable, kind of a general purpose brush, which is a different approach for me. It's much more direct painting. Often I start with large wash brushes when I start my painting. So this is a different approach than what I often take with my work. I've switched now to a still an Escoda Reserva brush, but now I'm working with a size 6, which is just a little bit larger. Still not a large brush, very much a small to medium brush. And I'm starting to work in the areas of negative space that are around the leafy shapes and the flower shapes. As I work through this very dark valued area that's in the negative space here in the background, I'm using a mixture of pyrrole red and sap green. It's a fairly rich mixture with a lot of pigmentation. And I'm also using the same mixture with a little bit of raw sienna added in, which is in this kind of area right there with a little bit of more of a gold tone to it. So as I work through this area, and I lead my wash around these shapes, I'll be using both mixtures off and on as I proceed through this background. So here, this area I'm painting right now has more of the sap green pigment in it, and the pyrrole red, and not so much raw sienna, and it's a darker kind of a very neutral green tone. These very earthy greens that I've been using so far lean more towards the warm side, and I want to introduce some mixtures of green that have a cooler influence to it. So I'm going to take some of that same mixture that I'm using with a pyrrole red and the sap green, and I'm going to add a little royal blue to it. The pigment of that paint is PV60, and it also goes under the name by some manufacturers of indanthrone blue or indanthrine blue or delft blue. But I like to use those three paints, pyrrole red, sap green, and royal blue, together to do a lot of kind of earthy, neutral greens. So as I do this painting, I'm not using any masking fluid. It's all direct painting, and I'm painting around right now the exterior edge of these leaf and flower shapes with this very dark value, kind of an earthy, dark valued green tone. And as I paint this, what I'm trying to maintain is a nice uh, even wash, even though there's some variation in it, but the color variation and even a little bit of value, but it's still uh, a pretty consistent value. But I'm trying to maintain a nice, smooth, consistent wash, and to do that, I work with gravity, so my board's at an incline, and I keep the edge, the leading edge of my shape that I've painted, moist. I keep that bead of water there. It's not a dripping bead of water by any means, but it's that leading edge is still very wet, and I'm leading that edge around these shapes, and as long as I keep that loaded up with moisture, I'm going to prevent getting a hard edge in my wash. And because I'm working at an incline, I know which direction that edge, that leading edge of moisture is going to flow. It's going to flow downwards, and I'm painting, even though it's not a horizontal edge, it still has a slant to it, and the paint is flowing down the paper, and I can control it that way. If it were laying flat, that moisture might backwash and start to give me unwanted edges and discoloration. So by painting at an angle and knowing which way that moisture is going to flow, I'm in control of my wash. Once I've started this wash, I have to continue with it till I get to all the edges of this shape that I'm painting. Because if I were to stop right now and walk away and come back and try and pick it up, I couldn't do that because the paint would start to dry. I wouldn't have that bead of water on the leading edge, and I'd have a hard edge right where I don't want it. So once I get going, I need to maintain that bead of water on the leading edge and continue to work it around the shapes that I'm painting around. Now I could pause and just load that edge up really well, and so it holds the moisture. It gives me a little bit of time, but in general, once I start applying this wash, I need to continue till I get to the other end of this edge that I've started, or the shape that I've started. And here I'm finishing off this shape that's one continuous wash, and now I'll stop and I'm going to dry my paper. I'm switching to a quill brush that I like to use for some of my detail work. It's got a nice sharp point and it holds quite a bit of paint. And I've loaded it up with a dark valued green, which is leaning towards a cool side. It's the same mixture, but it has a greater influence of the royal blue in it. And I'm putting in some of these very dark valued detail marks around these flower shapes. And it's an area where there's some very small spaces that the background, or the very dark colors, the dark values of the background show through. And as I start to put these marks in, you can see that these dark valued marks start to give more dimension to the flower shapes and start to bring more depth to the overall composition. These small shapes also are right besides some of the pure whites that I have in my composition, and they'll remain there. So it creates some of the greatest contrast, and it's doing it in an area where I want to draw the eye in, the area that I'm aiming to be more my center of interest and focal point. I brought some of these dark valued, smaller detailed shapes into various areas of the composition, and you can see that I'm still keeping it very much on the cool side. So it's a bluish green and less of an earthy, warm green. I'm continuing with a background wash, and I'm keeping the wash that I'm working into the composition right now a little bit more on the cool side, and I'll mingle that paint with some more of the earthier, warmer mixture too. But this area is a little bit deeper back in space and is going to be a little cooler here. So it's very similar to what I did towards the bottom. I've just varied the color a little bit, not much, but keeping it just leaning a little bit more towards the cool side. And then I'm going to work in some more of the warmer tones, the warmer earthier tones that have a little bit more of the pyrrole red and sap green with a little raw sienna in it. As I apply this wash, I'm working just as I did in the lower area of this painting, maintaining a bead of water on the leading edge and leading that wash around these shapes. And I think people are often afraid that when they do that, that the paint is going to flow down into an area that they don't want, especially when working at an angle, and give them problems. However, the dry paper is going to resist the flow of the paint, and the paint will follow the path of least resistance, which is the wet paper. So that dry paper provides enough resistance to keep that paint from flowing into it. And in fact, I think too, when people are leading this bead of water, they think that that bead is going to roll down into like this white area of the flower that you don't want it to be in. And actually, leading that bead along the edge gives you a nice clean edge, a cleaner edge than if you were hesitant and just use a damp brush loaded with paint because you're afraid of that bead rolling down your paper. It actually works more towards your advantage and gives you this nice clean edge, and the dry paper resists the flow of that bead of water, and it keeps you in control of what you're doing with your wash. And here again, I've continued this wash until I hit the end. And the fact that I have that leading edge allows me to work in other colors and still get a nice gradation and not a hard edge. And in this case, you can see there's a larger area that has a greater influence of raw sienna, but it migrates nicely with the other colors because I've kept taking the approach here where I'm using the leading edge and the bead of water and moving that wash across my page. I'm going to begin working on some of these leaf shapes, and to start, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a fairly consistent wash, which is a mixture of sap green with a little bit of cad yellow light in it, and it still has just a touch of pyrrole red to make it less raw and take a little bit towards neutral, but it's a little bit more yellow-green than some of the other mixtures I was using. And I'm going to take this fairly flat wash and I'm going to put it in a number of the areas where these leafy shapes are. Then I'm going to build on top of those some other washes to give it a little bit of detail. Here I continue to work in some of these other areas with the same wash, and you can see that it has it's a yellower green than what I was using in the background. Now here on the right side I'm using the same wash, but rather than paint individual leaves, there are many individual leaves here overlapping. I'm treating them as a larger single shape, and I'm applying the same wash just as I have on some of these other single leaves on the left side of my composition. Now I'm going to do some brush work on top of these washes that I've applied on these leaf shapes, and I'm using a mixture which is a different green. I'm using Hooker's green with a little bit of cad yellow in it, and just a touch of pyrrole red to keep it from being too raw. But it's more true green, less of a yellow or a blue green. And I'm taking my quill brush and I'm just making some shapes that are have some gradation within them and a little bit of softness going on in some spots. But I'm doing just this brushwork to give some detail to these leaves. I'm doing similar brushwork on this larger leaf shape, which is the largest leaf shape I have in my composition, but just letting some of the different features of the leaf start to stand out a little bit more and get detailed somewhat. And using this hooker green mixture on top of the sap green cad yellow mixture that I had applied earlier. At this point, I've come in with a second layer of wash on most of these leaf shapes, but I still have more to do. And here I'm working with a darker value mixture using that hooker's green with a little royal blue in it. And I'm just getting some of the darker value shapes. I'm going to apply a wash to this leaf shape, and I'm going to use a bit of a gradated wash on this. So it just kind of shades the leaf. A lot of my washes at this point have been fairly flat, but here I'm giving more of a gradation in value. I'm going to do the same here. I'm putting down some of this darker valued green, and then I'm coming back with some clear water, and I'm just going to soften that edge. I'm going to start working on this area of leaf shapes to the right. When I initially put a wash down, I treated it as one large shape, and now I'm coming back with darker valued greens and starting to give more definition to that area and starting to bring out single shapes of leaves by working in negative space. I'm painting around the edge of some of these other leaf shapes. Now I'm going to work on some of these other areas, and I'm going to change the tone of green just a little bit. I've added a little bit of cadmium yellow, and it's going to be a little bit brighter green. So it's still not leaning towards the red side at all. It's leaning more towards the yellow, but it's still a medium value. So there's not a lot of value change here in the shape that I'm painting now compared to the shape that's right beside it. However, as I paint this, you'll see that the actual tone that I'm using, the actual color I'm using, is very somewhat because I've added more yellow to it but kept it dark, and that's what I'm going to do up here too. So I have some of these shapes differentiated by fairly strong shift in value, and then some of these other shapes are differentiated not by a shift in value, but by a shift in the color of the green that I'm using, from a more of a blue-green to a yellow-green. Now I'm going to start working with a darker value, and it's not only darker, but it's more of a reddish tone. I'm still using combinations of here a sap green with the pyrrole red and a little bit of royal blue, but it's heavily influenced by a higher percentage of pyrrole red in this mixture, and it's a dark value. So now I have a strong shift in color from the green to the red tone, and the value is a bit darker than the green tone to the right. Now I'm going back over some of these other areas, and this would be a third layer of wash, and I'm still using this warm tone, but because it's over top of this darker green, it has a different appearance than the wash that I just applied above that to the left, which has more of a red tone. This is affected more because of the layers that are beneath it, but it still comes across as a warm tone, and that warm-cool play of warm-cool helps give more definition between these shapes. I'm going to paint this stem shape here, and I'm going to use burnt sienna, and I'm going to work in some raw sienna, and then I'll also use some mixtures that have the burnt sienna and royal blue that will give a dark, cool tone to it. So here I've brought in a little bit of a burnt sienna royal blue mixture, which is almost a neutral gray. The area that has the sunlight hitting it is more the burnt sienna and raw sienna mixtures. And then here I'm going to get into an area that has a strong, sharp-edged shadow. And I'm going to come in there with a dark mixture of the burnt sienna and the royal blue. So I have that fairly clean edge right there, and I'm going to just touch it on the edges a little bit with the dark mixture of that has the royal blue in it. I'm going to do the same there, just give a nice gradated shadow because I'm working wet into wet. Now I'm coming up into this other area where there's a heavier shadow, and this is a mixture which has quite a bit of royal blue, but still more towards the neutral side. But it's a nice dark value, and it gives that feeling of the deeper shadow. Now this area down here, which is in the background, isn't near dark enough. As I've started to build my values in my composition, I can see that I need to go much darker. So I'm coming back in here with a mixture that's similar to what I used up on the shadowed area of the branch that I just did. So this is a mixture which has a lot of royal blue and some burnt sienna in it, and it's a very dark value. As I put this darker value in, there's some areas here where I've come in with some clear water just to gradate that wash out, so it's not a solid dark tone. There's some elements of the wash from below coming through, and I'm going to continue to work that dark wash around this leaf shape, and I want to work in some warmer tones, some of that similar to that mixture that's influenced by the pyrrole red up at the top. I'm going to bring some of that in and gradate it into this darker valued wash, so I have some warm spots. And so you can see right there I've got a bit of a red tone right at the tip of that leaf that gradates out. Bringing some of that cooler dark mixture up here on this left side and deepen the value over here. Now I'm bringing some of these nice cool dark tones up here in some smaller shapes. And as I start to work some of these small dark shapes in here, you'll start to see how it really starts to give more definition to the elements in this composition, and starts to really send some of that background farther back and bring some of these lighter shapes forward. You can see the impact to the left there that some of those dark shapes have had, and I'm continuing to make some of these dark valued marks now in some of these areas where I have some of my lightest values, so it gives a really nice contrast in these areas. I want to cast some deeper shadows on some of these areas of the white flower. So I'm bringing a dark value here. This leans towards the blue side, and you'll see it clearer here as I start to give some more gradation to it and bring some clear water to the edge of this to soften the edge and gradate this tone out a little bit. So I've laid in a nice shape here with this kind of a grayed blue tone, and now I'm bringing some clear water. I'm just going to soften that edge. And I'm going to do a little bit more with that tone, thin down a little bit. It's still a mixture with some cobalt blue and rose madder in it, but I've added just a little bit of raw sienna to the mixture, and it's graded down a little bit. Here I'm doing a bit more brushwork with this grayed down mixture of the cobalt blue rose madder with some raw sienna in it. And keep in mind, when you're working and you want to bring in a color that's neutral and you have some mixtures you're working with, just keep in mind the complements, that the colors on the opposite side of the color wheel are going to grade whatever color you're working with down a bit. In this case, when I start mixing the blue and the rose madder together, I start to get a purplish tone. And when I bring in the kind of a warm yellow tone of a raw sienna, it starts to neutralize that mixture and gray it down. And this gives a nice color for me to use here in my shadowed areas. I'm using more of this gray tone on the left side here to do some of the similar type of brushwork that I did on the right side there, and put some of these areas in a little bit deeper shadow than what I've had. There's a green tone that's in the middle of the flower here between these stamen. So I'm using my detail brush to put some of that green tone in there. So I'm working in negative space when you look at it, the relationship of the area I'm painting in relationship to the positive yellow shapes. And it sets those forward just a little bit, but it gives that nice, the green, kind of a glow to that middle area that the flowers have. As my paint has dried, it's lightened quite a bit in some areas, and I've decided I want to get that background in this area still a darker value than what I've achieved so far. And similar to what I did below, where I came back in with another wash over top, I'm doing the same here. And actually, it's a little hard to see, but this very dark value is leaning heavier to the green side than the wash below, which is almost a very dark gray, almost black in some areas. But I've used some Hooker's green here in this mixture to give it more of a green tone. And I still want to keep kind of that nice variation of the warm and the cool and a little bit lighter tone here. So I'm going to, while this wash is still wet, and I have that, still have that bead of water on my leading edge, I can gradate in this nice warm tone. I couldn't get that nice gradation if I had stopped and let the green area dry and then come back with this warmer tone. I had to just work it into the bead of water. And you can actually see to the left in that green area, I have a little bit of backwash going on because I did let that area dry up a little bit as I was working. So now I'm getting a little bit of backwash, but it doesn't bother me too much in this composition. It just kind of feels like it belongs because there's quite a bit of this variation of light, dark, warm, cool going on in this overall wash. So I'm just going to leave that alone and let it dry as it is, and it just brings an area of interest to that background area. Now over on this right side, again, another area where I want to bring in some deeper values. So I'm taking that dark mixture that's leaning a little bit towards green, and I'm doing some brush work on this right side to deepen those background areas. At this point, I'm going to come in with a kneaded rubber eraser and remove those pencil lines. And I'm not going to get rid of all of them. There's going to be a few that'll remain behind. The more paint buildup you have over the lead, the harder it is to erase. But for the most part, it comes up, and it doesn't bother me to have some elements of the pencil sketch here and there throughout the painting. I think it gives a little bit of character. Here I'm at a point where I want to put in a few very precise kind of shadowed areas here, and this is a purple violet tone that I'm getting with a mixture of this cobalt blue and rose madder, but more pigmentation in it than what I've had so far. And it's kind of more precise brushwork here, just being very specific with some of these very dark purplish marks that I'm putting down. And something to keep in mind, you can only get these very precise brush marks when you want to work in some of this detail when working wet on dry. If your paper is wet, you just can't get this kind of brushwork. You can't accomplish it because it's going to diffuse into the water, and it's going to be a soft edge. So you have to make sure that you're painting your work surface is completely dry when you're trying to do this kind of specific brushwork. And in this case, when I'm working around the stamen of these flowers, I've built up some layers with some different colors. And if I were to go in there now and it was wet, this color would run, and I'd lose all that brushwork that I've done. It'd still be there, but it'd be very muted and not have a very favorable effect. There's times when you want that, but when you're trying to do some precise brushwork, and there's no masking here, so if I were to come in here and this were wet, I'd pretty much ruin that area of my painting. So if you want to do very precise brushwork and do some detail work, you have to make sure your paper is completely dry. I decided I want a little bit more color in this shadowed area here, so I'm coming back over this somewhat gray blue that I had with more of a violet tone and bringing a little bit more color to that shadowed area. I'm going to bring a little bit more of that color up here in this shadowed area also. I'm going to put a few final details in here in my painting, and I'll wrap this one up. So I've got a little bit deeper yellow here. I'm using some gamboge and putting a little bit richer yellow on the end of the stamen. Earlier in my painting process, I brought in some touches of opera to give that highlight of pink that a few of these blossoms have, but it needs to be more pronounced. I've lost to that tone really as I've gone along. So I'm just bringing a few touches of that opera to bring back that the very slight touches of pink tone that appear in a few of the blossoms. So we'll put a mat around this, and that's my painting, Blossoms in the Valley. I hope you've enjoyed watching this tutorial. If you get a chance, check out Rick Swartz Watercolor's friends and subscribers on Facebook. If you ever have questions about my materials, you can always go to the studio page of my website, rswartzart.com. If you have questions, you can email me at contact@rswartzart@gmail.com. If you want to see more videos, you can go to my YouTube homepage. Be sure to follow me on Facebook. If you enjoy this, don't forget to like it, share it, and comment. Thanks for watching.